He had fought 40 campaigns and won them all. But he had never fought for anything the way he fought for her. When she said yes, the Iron King wept. Their first night together. The world outside did not exist. There was only her warmth and the silence of a man who had finally laid down his sword. He watched her sleep as dawn came in. He had held cities. He had held armies. He had never held anything this carefully. She carried his child. He knelt before her like a supplicant before a goddess. This man who knelt before no one. When the boy came, he broke. Not in defeat. In something far more permanent. The warlord was gone. The father had arrived. They gave their son a name and their daughter a kingdom to grow into. And Lord Aldric Vane, conqueror of nations, learned to be brought to his knees by a 4-year-old. The children ran. The children laughed. The castle that had been built for fear was now full of noise and light. He played with them until the sun moved behind the hills. He had cancelled 2 councils. He had not noticed. They ate together every night. The great war table cleared of maps and replaced with food and laughter. This was the campaign he had chosen to win. They rode together through the kingdom he had built for her. She matched him stride for stride. She always had. They stood at the wall as the sun fell behind their world. He pulled her close and said nothing. Everything worth saying was already in the silence. She read to the children until they slept. He watched from the doorway. This was what power was for. He came home to find them running to meet him. She stood at the steps and smiled. 40 campaigns. Nothing had ever looked like that. They danced at court and the court forgot to breathe. She was the only reason he had ever learned to dance. He was glad, now, that he had. In the firelit dark they were not king and queen. They were simply themselves. 2 people who had chosen each other against every kind of odds. He laughed in court and his advisors did not know what to do. One of them dropped his papers. Aldric laughed harder. He granted a mercy the old Aldric would have refused without looking up. He looked up this time. He saw a man, not a case. The court began to whisper. The king had changed. Some said for the better. Some reached for their ambitions. Lord Malachar said nothing. He simply watched. And smiled the way a wolf smiles when it sees a gap in the fence. Aldric left the campaign on the map and walked to the nursery. His general's face was the face of a man watching an empire made of sand. Aldric did not look back. Malachar met with men who had grievances and room in their hearts for treason. He spoke of opportunity. He did not need to speak long. The Eastern campaign was postponed indefinitely. Malachar received the news and folded his hands. He had been waiting for exactly this. The kingdom thrived. Malachar plotted. Both things were true at the same time. He had chosen his knight. He had chosen his men. He had only to wait for the king to fall asleep beside his family. They came in silence through the gate that should not have opened. The men who opened it were already paid. The betrayal had begun before the first sword was drawn. The guards loyal to Aldric were set aside. Not killed, not yet. Malachar was careful about the optics of the thing. Aldric woke to the sound of his world ending. He reached for the sword that had never failed him, and walked toward the noise. Seraphine moved in the dark like a woman who had always known this day might come. She pressed her children into the arms of a woman she trusted. And she let them go, the hardest thing she had ever done. He fought through the corridors with everything he had. He was very good. There were simply too many of them. In the throne room they waited for him. A tide of steel that had spent months preparing for this one night. He gave them a fight worth remembering. He went to his knees in chains. Not from weakness. From mathematics. Malachar sat in the throne very slowly. He had been imagining this moment for 20 years. It was exactly as satisfying as he had pictured. They brought her before him. She stood with green eyes blazing like something feral and contained. He looked at her and wanted what he could never deserve. The iron door slammed. The bolts drove home. Aldric Vane, alone in the dark, began to plan his way out. She sat at his table in a dress she did not choose. She catalogued every face, every exit, every weapon within reach. He toasted his victory. She watched him drink, and thought about every way a man can fail. She would not bow. Not in her body. Not in her eyes. She made that perfectly clear. They forced her down. It was not submission. It was a woman memorizing the face of everyone in that room. He reached for her face. She moved with the speed of a hawk. He withdrew his hand and called her spirited, as though that helped him. They took her to his chambers. She walked in. She picked up a candlestick. He stopped. He held her as though holding was the same as having. She let him believe it. She was already 10 steps ahead. She sat alone in the morning light. She wiped her face once. Then she was stone. The note arrived with the trembling servant girl. The children were safe. Now she could do what needed to be done. She walked one step behind him through the court. She was displayed. She was assessed. She was underestimated. This was the last mistake they would make. He presented her to his allies as though she were a trophy. She held every man's gaze until he looked away. She was not a trophy. She was a soldier learning the terrain. A note passed in a feast with no one seeing. Fingers barely touching. Her words on their way to the men who still remembered their oath. He told her quietly that the children's safety depended on her behavior. She nodded. She began to count the hours. She had mapped every guard, every door, every rotation. Tomorrow night. She was ready. She poured his wine herself. Something dissolved in the dark red. He drank without looking up. 90 seconds. That was the gap. She had counted it 40 times. She counted it once more. Her fingers closed on the dagger hilt with the precision of a woman who had been waiting for this moment since the chains came off her wrists. She lifted it without a sound. She moved through the dark like water. Barefoot. Deliberate. No one saw her until it was too late to matter. The bells. The lights. The shouting. She broke into a run. And did not look back. 2 guards in a narrow corridor. She hit the first before he finished turning. The second lasted longer. Not much longer. She stood at the top of the wall. She looked down. She jumped. She rode. The night air in her face. The children ahead. Aldric ahead. Everything ahead. The general opened the door. His face said impossible. Her face said sit down and listen. 30 men in a barn before dawn. She spoke for 6 minutes. By the end they would have followed her to the edge of the world. One by one they drove their swords into the earth before her. She was not their king. She was something harder. She drew the route to the dungeon from memory. Every guard. Every turn. The plan was exact and it was hers. Through dark forest. No torches. 80 soldiers breathing around her in the trees. The castle ahead like a scar against the sky. She was at the head of the column. Sword drawn. A queen marching to rescue her king. The gates came down. The courtyard erupted. She was already past it, heading for the stairs. She fought through the fortress with the focused violence of a woman who has been waiting for this moment since the first chain was put on her wrist. She reached the door. She pressed her face to the bars. His grey eyes looked back at her, battered, sharp, and entirely unsurprised. The door opened. The chains came off. He stood. They stood for one breath in that dungeon, and looked at each other with the full weight of everything that had happened. Then she handed him a sword. They fought side by side through the fortress, in a way that could only be described as inevitable. Two people who had always been stronger together. Malachar stood in chains in the throne room, where he had sat and tasted power for too short a time. Aldric looked at him without anger. That was the most frightening thing. The children ran across the great hall. Seraphine caught them. Aldric's hand found hers. He had built an empire. She had rebuilt it once already. They would face whatever came next the same way they had faced everything else. Together. Unbreakable. Home. He knelt on the stone floor of the great hall and let the children climb into his arms. The crown sat on his head where it belonged. Seraphine's hands rested on his shoulders, not holding him up. Just there, as she had always been. Some men are forged by war. Aldric Vane was forged by love.